Good evening. Please take a seat as we will move on with the last event of the day. So before we start, I'd like to thank once again Mark Tester, the chair of the Web 2016, and also the entire Web team for the excellent job they have done in lining out exciting events for the day and also through the week, and more to come next week. But today it was a special day in the program because we had today a polar day, and the day started with exhibitions of how glaciers have changed over the past century that you can still visit in Building 1. So it's a beautiful installation looking at how glaciers have changed over the course of more than one century that will be open for a few more days, so I encourage you to visit it. And that was followed with a series of lectures, more technical, on changes in the Arctic and the research experiences of different members of KAUST, and also invited guests to KAUST. We are about to close the Polar Day today with an exciting lecture. And we will then close with a note that will have an element of testimony, and it will not be only based on cold scientific facts, but also the living experiences and the life experiences of a polar explorer. So today we have the pleasure to have with us Vijay Shah. Vijay Shah is an explorer, filmmaker, and aeronautical engineer from the UK that had a passion to explore the world, both in the horizontal, going to both ends of the latitude range of the planet, to the North Pole and also the South Pole, but also in the vertical, exploring the heights of the planet, where also the common element is ice and cold temperatures. And Vijay Shah has led expeditions for British exploring in different places of the planet, both in the Arctic and Antarctica, and also the high mountains in the Andes and also the Himalayas. He has climbed different high mountain peaks in all these mountain ranges, and also opened new routes in the high Arctic solo, doing that on his own, and also spend time also interacting with cultures in the high Andes and learning about their livelihoods and their concerns and worldview, and also meditating in the Himalayas by himself during quite a few days. And through that, he has been sharing his experiences through documentaries and films. And we have today the pleasure and the opportunity to listen to those experiences and how climate change is changing our planet, and particularly the polar areas, through the eyes of an explorer. So please join me in welcoming Vijay Shah to the stage.
Thank you, Carl. It was a very warm day in the Arctic. We were at the start of our expedition to cross the Penny Ice Cap on Canada's Baffin Island, and the -10 to -15 degrees that we had that day was the best we could hope for. This was my third expedition to Baffin Island and my sixth into the Arctic, the other three being on the European side of Svalbard, Arctic Norway, and Arctic Iceland. Baffin Island is the 5th largest island in the world, and no one's heard of it. It sits almost entirely within the Arctic Circle, and despite it being almost twice the size of the UK, it inhabits only 11,000 people, most of them being Inuit, making it one of the most sparsely populated places on this planet. Our expedition to cross the Penny Ice Cap started off in the little Inuit community of Kikatajuak, which is home to only 500 people. The Penny Ice Cap is Canada's most southerly of ice caps and is said to be left over from the last ice age. Our expedition aimed to open up a new route across the ice cap, but at the same time we had a number of educational elements to our expedition. Firstly, we were connected to a number of schools across the UK who were following our progress from the comfort of their classroom, and who could ask us questions directly, and we could answer them from the coldness of our tents. Our expedition, if all things go smoothly, would end up in the southern community, Inuit community of Pangnirtung, where we can fly out from. But at the start of the expedition, from Kikatajuak, we are transported out by snowmobile by our Inuit outfitters to a predetermined start point closer to the Penny ice cap. The Inuit often think we're mad for attempting such journeys, but for me, it is often that cold, hard snowmobile journey that I find most testing. But the scenery more than makes up for it. We pass icebergs that are halted still by the freezing seas on their journey south. They tower stories above us, and if you look closely on the bottom right of that photo, you can see a small figure, my teammate, and our snowmobiles next to this iceberg, and you can really appreciate the size of it. We passed Arctic seals that were sunbathing and then quickly drop into their snow holes and into the safety of the Arctic seas as our noisy snowmobiles approached, and Arctic hares that raced past us and straight up these mountain slopes without losing any speed. And then we came across these footprints. There is only one animal in the Arctic that can make footprints like this, and that is the polar bear. And you can really appreciate the size of these footprints when you can see my hand next to one of them. As well as those main adult footprints in the center of the screen, you can see two smaller prints on either side. And these were, of course, of young cubs. This was a young family, a mother and two cubs. And those footprints were disappearing off in the distance of the direction we were heading. It wasn't long then that we did come across the polar bear family, a mother and two cubs, just as we suspected. But the mother took fright from our noisy snowmobiles and she took off running at full speed. The young cubs worked hard to keep up with the mother, and we stopped and watched. As we were watching though, one of the cubs was falling further and further behind. He could not keep up with the pace that his mother was setting. Eventually, he got so far behind that he stopped. Utterly confused about what to do, he looked around, saw us, and started running towards us. It was clear we had to intervene. We used a snowmobile to chase the bear into the right direction. This worked. He found his mother's tracks, and he started following them. But it only worked partially. He was slow. He was going slowly, and his mother hadn't waited. She was kilometers away by now. A small conference between our Inuit outfitters, Billy and Charlie, and we came to the conclusion that we're going to have to intervene further. We're going to have to catch the bear ourselves with our hands and bring it back to its mother. It cannot survive by itself. We used the snowmobiles as pincers to cut off the bear's escape path, allowing us the opportunity to catch him. But his teeth were sharp and his claws are long, and he certainly didn't want to be caught. I managed to capture the last of this adventure on film, which I'd like to share with you now.
We're trying to get this cub back to its mother, but it of course doesn't want to be caught, and it's going to bite.
At this stage, I took over driving one of the snowmobiles, and I could not video record and drive at the same time. The next clip you see is after we have caught the bear using the tent to prevent it and us from getting hurt.
We'll just take it to the mother.
So at the end of this epic, we've caught the polar bear, and Billy's just taken over from me from driving, and we're releasing the other polar bear. There he goes. He's just attacking. Oh, he just got caught. He's going the wrong way. So the mother's on the hillside, and the cub, there he is, and there she is on the hillside. She's now waiting for him, and hopefully he will get to her. There's the mother and the other cub, and there's the baby. Polar bear trappers. How high?
That's a bit unusual for the mother just to leave, just like that.
She was very scared.
They usually wait for the cub.
How high?
Good thing we catch up the little one to the... I don't know.
Yeah.
Must be better. First down.
It was absolutely fantastic to see that young family reunited again and to see them trundle off on that hillside behind us. We were, though, many hours behind schedule on that first day of the expedition, and only by cannibalizing the fuel of one of the snowmobiles and all of us piling onto one of the snowmobiles that was left, that did Billy and Charlie manage to get us out to the start point just as the sun was setting. And as we made our camp in the polar night, Billy and Charlie had a cold and hard journey back to their community many hours away through the night. We were now at the start of the expedition. Billy, our Inuit outfitter, and the person you saw in that video there, is reporting that they are seeing more and more polar bears coming into the village than ever before. Scientists, though, that have been studying bear populations for a number of years are becoming increasingly worried about the state of the polar bear in the Arctic. Now, which of these is right? Bizarrely, they both are, but that is not good news for the polar bear. The polar bear is a highly adapted Arctic predator, an evolutionary process that has taken thousands of years. It has a dense, thick fur that leaves no skin exposed. Each hair of its fur is hollow, trapping as much air as possible to allow maximum insulation. It has a thick layer of fat that allows it to be buoyant and stay warm during those long and cold Arctic swims. It has strong limbs, allowing it to outpace seals, its primary source of prey. It has large feet, allowing it to disperse its weight on sea ice, and bumpy foot pads for the slippery stuff. Those great large feet are great for paddles for swimming too. It has a long, narrow skull and a strong, long neck and sharp teeth, allowing the polar bear to be a bold predator, diving headfirst into seal holes and having the strength to pull them out, its primary source of prey. The polar bear relies on sea ice for all of its major life functions. Sea ice is the platform that it hunts its primary source of prey, the seal. It uses the sea ice to track a mate and also for breeding. The polar bear only survives on land, using up the fat reserves that it has gathered up during a successful season of hunting from the ice. But the sea ice is more important than just for the polar bear. The sea ice is an enabler for the entire Arctic food web. You can think of the sea ice as an upside-down soil, where on the underside of the sea ice, algae and other photosynthetic phytoplankton can grow. This feeds the copepods and other zooplankton, which is the primary food source for the Arctic cod. The Arctic cod is the staple diet of almost all of the large marine mammals in the Arctic, from the narwhal, the unicorn-shaped fish, mammal, to the beluga whale, to almost every species of seal, which is the food source for the polar bear. So in short, without the sea ice, there will be no Arctic cod, and without the Arctic cod, the entire Arctic food chain breaks apart. And the sea ice is disappearing. Data from NASA taken periodically shows a decadal decrease per decade of 13.3%. In 2012, the actual volume of sea ice plummeted to a record low of only 20% of that existed in 1979. It is melting at a tremendous rate, and at this rate, the Arctic will be ice-free by mid-century in the summertime. The Arctic and the sea ice is melting due to increasing global temperatures as a result of climate change. Soaring carbon dioxide and methane levels within our atmosphere has pushed the greenhouse gas concentrations to record levels. It is this instability in our atmosphere that is causing the climate change. A recent study compared the levels of greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere to the last time in history that they were at a similar level. The last time that they were at a similar level was 2.7 million years ago. And at that time, sea levels were 20 meters higher than today. Now that could very well be the new equilibrium that our world will settle into. Jeddah, like many of the most populated places on the planet, will be completely underwater in such an eventuality. This won't happen overnight, or not in our lifetimes. But the inertia of the world is such that if we want any chance of being able to prevent this, then the window of opportunity to make a change is closing very quickly. And one creature is already suffering. Because of the melting of that sea ice, the habitat of the polar bear has been decreasing massively. As a result, they are going onto land earlier and earlier, looking for food. The keen sense of smell brings them into the human communities, to the Inuit villages, and there they get into conflict with man. It is often that the bear becomes worse off in such a conflict. I'm really excited about this next video. I've just received special permission to show you this documentary that was broadcasted on the BBC just before Christmas, called The Hunt, showing the plight of the polar bear and narrated by Sir David Attenborough.
The polar regions are the least inhabited and the most remote wildernesses on Earth. Here in the Arctic, the top predator is the polar bear. Over almost 500,000 years, these bears have adapted to the Arctic's dramatic annual changes of season. They're the only predators to hunt on sea ice, and they rely on it for almost all of their prey. But due to changes in the global climate, the ice is getting thinner. And their season for hunting is getting shorter. The bears are going hungry because the winters here have become warmer and shorter, and the summers longer and hotter.
The bears need the sea ice as a platform to hunt their prey, to travel. They mate out on the sea ice, but we've seen sea ice breaking up around 2.5 to 3 weeks earlier and forming around 2.5 to 3 weeks later. And so the bears have less time to feed. They're thinner. They don't have the same amount of fat on their bodies.
We're seeing fewer cubs being produced, declines in cub survival, bears coming ashore in poorer condition, weighing a lot less now than they did 30 years ago.
Climate change is happening fairly rapidly, and so even though these bears are really good at fasting and living off their body reserves and going long periods without food, what we're seeing is we're starting to push these bears to their physiological limits. And as they're pushed to the limits of their body reserves, obviously that has implications for their survival.
More than any other predator, the polar bear has evolved to cope with dramatic changes in the Arctic seasons. But with the current pace of climate change, the bears simply cannot adapt fast enough. If polar bears are to survive, we will all have to play our part.
It took us 19 days to cross the penny ice cap. Some days we woke up and the inside of our tents resembled that on the top left photo. We had to build snow walls each evening to protect our tent from being blown away or destroyed by those strong Arctic winds. And we had to ensure all of our exposed skin was covered against the elements from the sun, the cold, and the wind. But we were there. We're so close to Pangnerton. We're 1 day away. And we're very much looking forward to finishing the expedition, to get to Pangnerton, to speak to other people, civilization, and most importantly, a hot shower. But we woke up that last morning in a blizzard, whiteout conditions. The whiteout confuses and disorientates, and we cannot even tell the difference between where the ground ends and the sky begins. There is no reference points. We had to rely solely on our compass for direction. But we were motivated. It was only a few short hours before we will be in Pangnerton. We will have this expedition wrapped up. And so we began skiing in earnest. A couple of hours though into the ski, I was in front, and we came over a patch of wet snow. I looked around and saw the tracks of my skis filling up with water. This can only mean one thing: thin ice. We could not see more than 2 meters in front of us, and not knowing which way to go, we did our best to try and avoid this section of ice and still head towards Pangnerton in the right direction. But within 100 meters of traveling, I heard that sound I did not want to hear, a crack. And looking behind me, I saw a big hole emerge, and Duncan, one of my teammates, fall straight through into the Arctic Sea below. Fortunately, his polk didn't fall in with him, which would have filled up with water and dragged him down. However, we're still in a very dangerous situation. Duncan had to get out very quickly. All of this time, the more time he spent in there, the water will be seeping into all of his clothing, sapping his strength. Neither could Anthony or I approach the edge of that hole. He was obviously in very thin ice section, and having cracked and broken already, had we approached that hole ourselves, we could have fallen in as well, as the ice could have broken up further. The best situation is if he could get himself out of that hole. He got himself in there. Whilst Anthony was prepping the rope, I encouraged Duncan to get himself out, of course. Stop, Pangnerton's away, not far away. We're going to have a hot shower. No need to wash yourself there. After getting over the initial shock of falling in, he moved to the edge of the ice. Using his arms on top of the ice, he tried to haul himself out. As he was trying, the ice broke away under his weight, and a new edge formed 1/2 meter away. We encouraged him again. He moved to this new free edge, and he tried again, pulling his arms on there and trying to haul himself out. Again, the ice broke away. By now, his strength reserves will be reducing as the cold will be penetrating his entire body. We encouraged him to try a different section of the hole. He moved over to another edge, and then he put his arms on. This time, the ice held, and he managed to crawl and pull himself out in the most Yeah, it was a horrible sight to see. And his skis and all. The most dangerous part was over. However, we were not in the clear just yet. We were still on perilous ground. We were still in this region of sea ice that was very, very thin. Duncan was absolutely soaked to the bone with freezing cold Arctic waters. Once the adrenaline had worn off, he will be suffering from that cold very quickly. And we were still in the blizzard. And so began the most testing portion of the expedition, that last ski section. We were very surprised to find the ice so thin at that time of the year. It should have been fine to ski into Pagneton at that time, but this is the new reality that we have to get used to. One of the most sought-after rites of passage that explorers and adventurers embark on is the ski from land to the geographic North Pole over the sea ice. This has been going on every year. People have been doing this sort of expedition in the summertime every year, all until last year. There were no attempts in 2015 due to the early breakup of sea ice on the North Pole, and it is unlikely that anyone would attempt this crossing again. There are two things that we should consider and remember when we talk about the melting of the Arctic. Firstly, that what is happening in the Arctic is happening everywhere around the world. The Arctic is at the forefront of climate change and sees the effects there before anywhere else, but it is happening. And secondly, that this whole world is interconnected. All the weather systems are interconnected, and what happens in the Arctic affects elsewhere. I was in the north of England for my New Year's holidays, but it was underwater. In early December, a storm came through, bringing torrential rains, record rainfall that had never been seen before. A once-in-a-100-year event, they said. A week later, another set of rains came in, flooding more towns and cities across the north. A week later, another storm came through, doing the same thing again. This pattern continued until even last week, when we're hearing stories about Scotland being flooded. It is quite clear then, and it will come as no surprise then, that December was recorded the wettest month in Britain that has ever been recorded. If a country such as the UK struggles to cope with what I see as the very beginnings of climate change, how can we expect anyone else to? But this extreme weather event, this flooding that has happened in Britain this winter, can be linked directly to what is happening in the Arctic by way of how it affects the jet stream. A jet stream is a meandering river of air that circumnavigates the globe. It is the primary means that weather systems are transported from west to east. And one of the major factors that affects the jet stream is the temperature differential between the cold Arctic and the warm tropical zones. A strong temperature differential, a high temperature differential, such as when the Arctic is very cold and the tropical zones are very warm, means that the jet stream is strong, powerful, and those meanders are very slight. However, when the inverse happens, such as due to a warm Arctic, due to the melting, and you have a smaller temperature differential, the jet stream becomes weaker. It becomes slower, and those meanders become greater, which brings more extreme and prolonged weather events, such as the flooding that we have experienced in Britain this winter. This affecting the north does not mean that the Middle East will be exempt. A recent study had a look and compared the large or frequent heat waves that can pass through the region. They were considering a particular event, that when temperatures increase greater than 35 degrees Celsius in very wet and humid conditions, then the body can no longer sweat. Sweating is the primary means that the human body can regulate its internal body temperature, and without being able to sweat, it could prove fatal. The researchers said that and found that this sort of event has never happened in Earth in all records. But what they found, though, that if climate change is allowed to continue in its current way forwards, in the business as usual scenario, if we make no changes, that towards the end of the century, large parts of the Middle East would start seeing these major heat events coming, such as Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, where it is rich enough to keep all of its inhabitants and citizens within air-conditioned and protective environments, can probably cope with such events. But poorer regions and poorer countries may become uninhabitable as a result. These extremes levels of droughts, floods, heat waves, and all manners of extreme weather events will lead to crop failures and food scarcity across the globe. The globe there on the middle of the screen shows the current level of food insecurity, which ranges from a light beige yellow color, showing us low level of food insecurity, to a high level of food insecurity, which is a dark brown red color. The areas grayed out are areas and countries deemed rich enough not to have a level of food, any problems with food security. If we look at what is projected now towards the end of the century, the globe becomes very different. We start seeing almost the entire continent of Africa and South Asia starts to see high levels of food insecurity, with South America not far behind. This is going to lead to major regional conflicts and a greater level of migration and movement of people, environmental refugees, greater than we have ever seen before. From whichever angle we look at it, climate change is going to have a major negative impact in all of our lives, wherever we are on this planet. It is clear that we have to do something about it. And we have agreed to do something. Just last December, 1 month ago, 190 countries gathered together at the COP21 conference in Paris and agreed to do something. What they agreed to do was to limit the effects of global warming and climate change to within a 2 degrees Celsius limit above pre-industrialized levels. The top graph there shows the global average temperatures normalized to the 1850. And the blue line shows how we can achieve a 2 degrees Celsius limit target towards the end of the century. The red line shooting upwards shows what would happen to global average temperatures if we just carry on as we are doing. The Arctic, though, would see temperatures far greater than that red line, being at the forefront of climate change. The graph below shows what we need to do with our greenhouse gas emissions in order to have any chance of achieving this 2 degrees Celsius target. The blue line shows that we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions right now, this year, and continue to do so every year until by the end of the century, we are producing no more greenhouse gas emissions than we were in 1850. And that is considering the increasing in population and the technologies that we use. A formidable task. Some of the big things that we must do, we must rely on our governments and our leaders to enact, such as new methods of energy production and power generation that does not use fossil fuels. But this 2 degrees Celsius target is also dependent on our actions and our consumptions. We all know about limiting how much we fly and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by flying, and equally about limiting the amount we drive and those journeys, which produces more greenhouse gas emissions. But there is one other industry that we often forget about, one that contributes a greater amount to climate change than the entire transport industry combined, and that is the livestock industry. Producing 14.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, the livestock industry, the production of meat and dairy, is one of the primary causes of climate change, and one that we must reduce. It is the unique digestive systems of livestock, and in particular cattle, that produces huge amounts of methane. And it's their waste and manure that produces copious amounts of nitrous oxide. Both of these gases are far more potent in their greenhouse gas emissions than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, with methane being 25 times as potent and nitrous oxide a staggering 300 times as potent. Livestock is also hugely inefficient, using up the majority, in fact, it is the number one primary use of land by humans around the globe. As a result of producing enough pasture land and grain to supply the livestock, it leads to mass deforestation, which compounds the ability of our planet to be able to react by itself to climate change. The 2 degrees Celsius target for limiting global warming cannot happen without a substantial reduction in livestock, and this must start with our own consumption, with demand. When I think about the challenge that is in front of us, it is huge, and thinking about it can be quite daunting. But when I do think about it, it also reminds me about going on an expedition, about launching an expedition, planning for it, and executing it. One of the reasons why we love to hear stories about expeditions to some of the most inhospitable places on the planet is because the chances of success are slim. The adventurer or explorer must overcome massive obstacles and challenges to succeed, but sometimes they don't. Our expedition to cross the Penny Ice Cap, where we came across the polar bear, and towards the end of the expedition, Duncan fell into the sea ice, was actually the second time that I attempted that journey. The first time, 3 years earlier, we turned around 7 days into the expedition. We turned around because of me, because my toes froze. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make. But to continue on would have been absolutely foolish, knowing that I would probably lose my toes, my feet, and a lot more. But I did not feel guilty about that, about turning around, because I knew, and the team knew, we had done everything we could in order to make that a success, to even sleeping in plastic bags before we get into our sleeping bags, and plastic bags over our feet even before we put our socks on, to limit the amount of moisture. But without attempting that 3 years earlier, we may never have had the chance of success that we did do 3 years later. And the views from the other side are spectacular. Being also an aeronautical engineer, I am very much attracted to and enthralled by what I see as the greatest exploration that our species has embarked on, and that is the exploration of space. And when I think of this great challenge, I turn to one of the most impassioned speeches that I see has ever been made in history. This speech given by John F. Kennedy in 1962, where he committed to America to go to the moon before the end of the decade. This was a formidable feat, as it was only a year earlier, in 1961, did the Americans put a man into space for the very first time. And here's an excerpt of the speech.
But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And they did go to the moon. In 1969, with the whole world watching, Neil Armstrong put those first few footsteps on the moon. Now surely, if a nation can rally themselves to such a monumental goal within a few short years, then surely as a globe we can commit to reduction of climate change and the effects of that when our very future relies on it. In 2010, we took a group of students and recent graduates out to Baffin Island in the summertime to live amongst the Inuit and to trek almost 300 kilometers across some of the most spectacular scenery on the planet. As part of the expedition, we were also creating classroom resources, and we were connected again directly to a number of schools in the UK via our web platform and satellite communication, where the students and pupils from those schools could ask questions directly to the members of the expedition about what it was like there. As part of the projects, I conducted a video project where I asked the members of the expedition and the other leaders about the effects that this environment has on their view of the world, and in particular about climate change, when this is at the forefront of climate change. Ironically though, I almost didn't get a chance to finish this project, as we almost had a disaster on our hands due to unseasonably warm temperatures. As part of the expedition, there were a number of rivers that we had to cross. Rivers are often the dangerous parts of the expedition. These rivers are fed directly off the glaciers from the meltwater. This is a completely normal process, and that melting that happens in the summertime is often replenished during the winter months. But due to this warm period that we're having, with temperatures greater than 20 degrees Celsius in the Arctic, the melting was greater, the rivers were higher and more powerful, and crossing them became more dangerous. And this was the last river we had to cross. We had done 4 or 5 quite large systems, and we were only a few days away from Pangnirtung, and this was the last big river system. Here we have Anthony and Rachel scouting out the crossing before committing the rest of the group to. They were the other 2 leaders. We had woken up especially early that morning in order to make that crossing at 4 a.m. to catch the river at its lowest point before the heat of the day would heat up the glacier and create more meltwater, pushing it higher. Typically, we don't cross rivers that are greater than knee height. It is unlikely that you can keep a stable foothold and are likely to be washed away in such an instance. In that photo there, you can see that the water is just below knee height there on both Anthony and Rachel. The way that we cross the rivers is you both face upstream, with Rachel, who's behind Anthony, holding onto his bag, supporting him as they sidestep together across the river. And this was the last photo that I took before I launched a rescue mission for Anthony and Rachel. I split up the group into 3 rescue teams and sent them out into the water. No sooner had I sent them out did Anthony and Rachel lose their footing and start to be swept away. Their bags filled with water, dragging them under, and they struggled to keep their heads above water. Fortunately, the rescue missions, 2 of them managed to grab Anthony and 1 of them managed to grab Rachel, and they managed to drag them ashore. They were severely beaten up and bruised by that river and cut up, and they were soaked to the skin, bordering on hypothermia. But fortunately, this disaster was averted, and I managed to finish my video project. I'd like to share with you a portion of that video project where both Anthony and Rachel are talking about the climate. The climate is changing, and we are contributing to this. But why should we care?
Why? Because there's since time began, it's estimated 99% of all species on the planet have become extinct. And yes, that's nature's cycle, and kind of that's the law of nature and all the rest of it. But how long have we really been around for in terms of how are we technologically advanced? Is it since the Industrial Revolution? Is it since the birth of Christ? Is it looking back further than that? The environment we're in here, these rocks are like 2.2 billion years old. In our time scale, Industrial Revolution, 150, 200 years. In a whole scheme of things, we haven't been around for that long, but yet we're having the biggest impact on the planet. Why is that important? Because, we need to, be very aware that we don't slide into that 99% category just yet.
I think we need to, for the wider population, we need it to conserve our environment that we thrive in so well, because it's the perfect environment that we can live in. But for me personally, I love the planet as it is. I want all the species there. I want to learn. I want to go into the rainforest and see them there. I don't want to go into a patch of grass full of cows for McDonald's burgers. I want to actually go into the Amazon. I want to be able to go onto the ice caps and see them and experience the world how it is. And then I think for the wider world, it's the environment that we thrive in. And we need it. Otherwise, we don't know how we're going to survive afterwards.
Limiting climate change is not about saving the planet. This planet has endured climatic conditions far in extreme of what we're talking about here. But our very evolution on this planet has happened in a relatively cool part of the Earth's history, and all of our advanced technologies and societies relies on it. I'd like to finish off by reiterating what Rachel said there towards the end of that video. For me, I personally want to continue going into the rainforest, onto those ice caps and on to the sea ice in the Arctic. And I wish that every single one of you gets to also experience these spectacular places on our planet. But it's bigger than that. And as Rachel said at the end of that video, we need it. Otherwise, we don't know how we're going to survive. Thank you. Now, I've just talked about the Arctic this whole time. Just an hour ago, my teammate that is down in Antarctica, in fact, Anthony, that you saw in that video there, sent a message from Antarctica about what the state of Antarctica. Here we've got a little voicemail from satellite phone.
Hello everyone at Keynote University in Saudi Arabia. It's Anthony Goodman and I'm just phoning up from Antarctica. It's an absolute pleasure to be phoning in and wishing you all the very best. I've been down here at a place called Union Glacier for the past couple of weeks, and working hard in linking Antarctica into schools. Since being here, I've had a fantastic time learning and speaking to some of the scientists working down here on Antarctica, especially those from British Antarctic Survey. Over the past 8 years now, I've been travelling to both Arctic and Antarctica, doing, I suppose, remote expeditions and linking the experience back into schools. Over that time, I've been amazed at how the polar regions have been changing due to climate change. The British Antarctic Survey scientists that I've been speaking to recently are conducting research into looking at how the ice shelves around the continent here have been receding in recent years. So in particular, the Ronnie ice shelf makes up a large area of the of Antarctica, and there's a lot of worry in how the ice shelf might break apart and disappear in forthcoming years. So the biggest impact of if the ice here in Antarctica was to disappear, then the biggest impact would be on a rise in sea level. And the impact of that would be as well looking into the change in acidification of the oceans and the resulting impact on biodiversity. It's a beautiful place here, and it's very hard to kind of explain, but especially a couple of years ago when I skied from the coast to the South Pole, it was a total distance of some 730 miles, and when you're travelling across this vast, what's perceived as an empty and very, I suppose, desolate landscape, how beautiful at the same time it really is. And skiing across the continent, of course, you're going from sea level to some 9,000 feet, which is the height of the South Pole. The depth of that ice is about 2,500 meters. So there's a vast amount of fresh water kind of locked up in the glaciers and the ice cap itself. And of course, if that was to disappear, then sea levels, could potentially rise by some 60 odd meters. It's a real humbling experience to be down here because you realise the beauty of the world, but also even in an environment that seems so not necessarily hostile, but so different to what we're used to. But in actual fact, it's not. Well, it's quite a delicate environment as well, and I suppose our actions in our normal, in how we live, have a big impact on on other environments that seem so remote to us. And it's not until we actually go to these places that we realise that, in actual fact, we're all connected. So I hope that one day that I'll be able to come out and to share my experiences in a bit more detail. I hope that you have a fantastic time with my teammates Dave and Vijay. And please, if you have any questions or would like to ask me any questions, then I'm down here for another week. And it would be an absolute pleasure to answer any questions that you might have. So feel free to get in touch. And
well, that was the satellite phone out in Antarctica. The reception's not that great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vijay, for that presentation. I think this has been a very good end to a very good day where we've been focusing on the polar and the effects of climate change, environmental change more broadly on the poles. It's good to provide, to receive a polar explorer's view of this current and future environmental situation. I think you have enriched our day very well in this enrichment program, adding your more aesthetic dimension to our considerations. So thank you very much, Vijay. Are there any questions people would like to ask Vijay? Okay, far away up there on the balcony. What happened to your friend who fell through the ice? Does he still have his toes?
He does have his toes. He was the last in line to have a shower, actually, when we got to Paddington.
Poor chap.
He was fine. It was a very hard skiing session. He was becoming increasingly cold. And towards the end, he was falling over all the time. His strengths and reserves were diminished. But fortunately, we were only within hours away from Paddington. Otherwise, we would have found a safe place, made camp, and got him warm again.
Okay, thank you. There's a question down near the front.
Yes, on a much less serious subject. Since global warming is an anthropogenic effect, how can we avoid speaking about issues related to the size of human population? And how do you handle this? Because we studiously avoid ever talking about human population.
That's a very, very good question. Human population is increasing. It's expected 9 billion by, I think, the mid-century, or 2050 to 9 billion. That is something we may need to talk about, but that is something that you could say is out of very much near-term control. What the things that we do have control of is what we consume, choices we make as individuals, as people that know about how our countries behave individually, together, and there are a lot of changes that we can make that will have a much greater impact. And I believe only then, if we have made all of these changes, then we can start talking about another factor. I think that it's very easy to think and say, well, I'm not changing one aspect because there's this other aspect that is equally as demanding. So I'm just going to wait and see. That's so easy to do, and we probably all do it. But if we carry on doing that, then there will be no changes.
Yeah, we do need to reduce the increase in population and also reduce the consumption per capita. I mean, you mentioned the meat eating because of the extreme emissions of greenhouse gases from the intensive
Absolutely.
cow industry. So these things are both needing to be done, I'm sure. There's a question up just near the sound control.
Thank you very much, Vijay. That was really helpful. My name's George. I've worked in solar energy here at KAUST. I've been here for 6 years as a founder. I'm very proud to be a part of this. What I find is interesting about KAUST is that it is like a small world of its own. We've got 103 different nationalities here. We're all working together towards a common cause. And I suppose what I find interesting about KAUST, having worked here and trying to work on some of the things that KAUST represents, we have a per capita energy usage of between 5 and 7 times the US national average. We have a 62 megawatt constant draw of electricity to what we do here. We have one of the highest water usages per capita in the world, if not the highest, by several times. And what I would like to ask you is, KAUST as a destination, as a location, as a beacon of hope in the region, what is our responsibility at KAUST to ensure that what we do in how we do what we do acts as an exemplar for the rest of the world? And what can we do about that, do you think? Thank you.
That is very good. In fact, I was only learning today about some of the more progressive technologies and the science that you do here today from Petrina. That is a very good question. I think education is the key, and we keep talking about that, and we talk about the the children being the new generation, we must educate them. Well, I was, I guess, one of these children. We were the first generation to grow up learning about global warming, and yet what impact have we made? You know, very little. But what we can do is such as KAUST. How did that come about? It came about because some people had visions, people that wanted to make a change. Sadly enough, though, people don't really engage with the topic unless it affects them. And it's only now, in the last 4 or 5 years, that outside of the Arctic, that people are beginning to see the effects of climate change that are negatively impacting them. So I guess when someone's had their house flooded, or the storms that are passing through the United States absolutely destroying certain parts, well, you can educate them about why that is happening. And education is the key. That's the only thing I can say.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I think we're going to need to draw proceedings to a close. Vijay has given an outstandingly interesting and pleasant and complimentary presentation to those we've had during today, but he's not here unaccompanied. He's also here with another gentleman from the expedition. I'd like him to come up to the stage as well, David Hart. Could you come up, please, David? And if you could join Vijay just there, please. Thank you very much. And I'd just like you, I'd like to present both these gentlemen with our beacon. So you mentioned very well in the last question, our beacon of hope. So I have a beacon to give both of these gentlemen, and while I do this, I'd like you to join me in thanking them for all their help and contribution to KAUST. Thank you.